Germany. Today's guest and today's episode will be a very controversial topic. Our guest today is an American economist of the Austrian tradition, and he is the distinguished professor of free enterprise at Ball State University. He also authored many books like Austrian Economics, an Introduction, and a prize-winning book, Microfoundations and Macroeconomics in Austrian Perspective. Please join me in welcoming Professor Stephen Horwitz.
Well, thank you all. See, it's so the only thing about Zoom is I can't hear anybody applaud. That's the sad part.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. Christina's got it. That's what you do. Well, thank you all. Thank you all for having me. It's I think making, as we say, making lemonade out of lemons is always a good thing. And given what COVID has done to the ability of folks to travel and things like that, I think, the more of these sort of things that we do, they're worthwhile in themselves, even if we can travel. I think sort of being able to bring in folks from across the world and give us the opportunity to speak to audiences in other places is terrific. So I'm glad you're all here. I think what plan is for today is I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes and then we'll open it up to questions and conversation. I have some PowerPoint slides, mostly because I want to be able to present some data to you. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and put that up in just a minute. There we go. Let's make sure that is working correctly. Okay, we're good with that. We can see it. Okay. All right. So my title is "Are the Poor Getting Poorer?" And let me just say a few words about what I want to do with that. If I can get this to, there we go. So here's sort of my overview of what I want to do. First, I want to start by saying that concern about inequality and poverty are not the same thing. You can have rising inequality even as the poor are getting richer. And then one of the questions I'll throw out to think about now is whether that doesn't describe some of the things we're seeing in advanced market economies right now, that inequality might be on the rise, but there's a separate question of if inequality is on the rise, that doesn't necessarily mean the poor are getting poorer. They might be getting richer as well. You can also, and this is really important, have rising inequality at the same time the people who comprise the rich and who comprise the poor are changing every year. So oftentimes we say things like, well, the rich increase their share of income from 45% to 50%, and the poor lost from 5% to 4%. But one of the things to remember about that, it's not the same people year to year, right? People move up and some move down the income distribution, the income ladder, what economists call income mobility. So I think that's another issue we want to think about as we think about these issues today. But what I want to focus on, at least in my 20 minutes, and I'm happy to answer all these other questions or talk about all these other issues as we go on. In my 20 minutes, I want to talk about this question of whether the poor are poorer than years ago. Okay, and so years ago here is a broad term. Most of the comparisons I'm going to make are to the 1970s, roughly. It is an easier game for me to go back farther. It seems obvious, perhaps, that poor people today are better off than poor people were, say, 100 years ago or 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago. I think that when most people sort of make the claim that the poor are getting poorer, they're thinking of more recent. They're thinking of life in the 1950s or 1970s. So that's kind of going to be my basis of comparison. The other thing I want to do is, at least again in the PowerPoint, we can talk about in the Q&A other sorts of things. In these PowerPoint slides, I'm actually going to focus on the question of consumption and not income. In other words, the question I want to ask is, what are poor people able to consume today compared to what poor people were able to consume 20, 40, 60 years ago? And say, again, 1970s, roughly speaking. That's the comparison I want to make. And I want to make it using consumption data. What do people have in their houses? Because at the end of the day, the only reason we care about income, at least from an economic perspective, is because of what it enables us to purchase and how those things enable us to satisfy our wants, improve our lives, live better, longer lives, all the kinds of things that we might think about as being desirable. So for me, one of the things to focus on is to look at consumption rather than income. I'm happy to talk about income. I've got other slides if we want to do that later, but I'm going to talk about consumption. And the way we're going to do this is a method that enables us to sort of make these comparisons through time in a pretty effective way. And that is the following. We want to ask the question, how much time, how much work time, how much time at work does it take people to buy different goods at different times in history? So how many hours did the average person have to work, say, in 1920 to purchase a 3-pound chicken? How many hours did the average person in 1920, say, have to work to purchase a pair of pants, right? We can ask these same questions. We can look at average wage rates. We can look at the price of goods, and we can sort of compute this time. A couple of things to say about this. One is that the measure of wages we're going to use is the average private sector wage. That's the one measure that we have pretty good data on going back a fairly long way. So that's one thing. Second thing is, some of you who know some economics might be thinking, wait, is he making an argument about a labor theory of value? We know that's wrong. Labor theory of value doesn't work. This is not a labor theory of value. This doesn't say that the price of the good depends on how much work went into it. This is just a way of measuring these changes in people's purchasing power, the changes in their ability to purchase things based on the value, on the sort of value of their time and the value society attaches to human labor. It's not an explanation of price based on labor. It's a way to compare through time. And one of its advantages is that it enables us to sort of put aside inflation and all these other things. That's all accounted for in the changes in wages that we're looking at. The last thing I'd say here is that this is, again, as I said, this is a way of, particularly when we're talking about the average wage. So, you know, that there's obviously people doing better than that. There's people doing poorer than that. That's the data we have. I will have some data about consumption in the poor specifically, but as we use this labor hours measure, remember, this is an average and there's going to be differences in different places. So with that in mind, oh, I know the one more thing I want to say. One of the nice things about using this measure is that time is the most important and most scarce resource we have, right? In some sense, if we want to understand how wealthy a society is, we can ask, how much time do people have to spend acquiring the necessities of life, like, you know, food and shelter and clothing? How much time of their lives do they spend having to do that? If it's not a lot, they've got time left over, time that they can use to either consume leisure or to work to buy other things like cell phones and big screen TVs and all the rest. So that's why I think time is a particularly nice way of looking at this. So with that in mind, here are some goods. This is from the Sears catalog. Sears is barely still in business here in the United States. But here are some labor time costs of some common household goods. And the comparison here is 1975 and 2006. And I'll note here, a lot of my data stops around 2006 or so. There's one reason for that is that when I first started doing versions of this talk, it was not long after the 2007, 2008 recession and housing crisis and all that. And the data is messed up when you're in a deep recession like that, because we're really looking for long run trends. And so as I've done this more over the years, right, I've tried to add more recent data on, but some of the data I have just stops there. I can tell you from what I do know of the data that everything I'm going to talk about, the long run trend has continued in pretty much the same way. So if we look at things like a freezer for your house, right, it takes about half the time to purchase a freezer at the average wage. An answering machine, I love this one because who has an answering machine anymore, right? Our voicemail on our phones do all this. A garage door opener, work boots, a tire for your car, a mower for your lawn, all of these things, right? Much cheaper in terms of the hours people have to work at the average private sector wage to be able to purchase those things. I've got, again, some other slides that look more historically at this, but the trend is almost universally downward, that all of these things are cheaper in terms of labor time, okay? And that, by the way, is from Don Boudreau's wonderful, Don Boudreau's work at Cafe Hayek, which is a wonderful blog. If you don't read Cafe Hayek, you should. Here's some changes in labor time cost, again, with some other household stuff between 1973 and 2009. And again, here you can sort of see what the what the average wage was, and in 1973 was $4.12 an hour, 1872 in 2009. You can see the retail price. That's the sticker price of these things. If you went to like a Sears catalog or somewhere and sort of looked and, well, how much would it cost to buy a color TV in 1973? $400. That would have been about 97 hours worth of work. Today, you can buy the comparable TV for about 2009 for about $300, which is only 16 hours of work. And I picked the color TV example because it also helped us understand something else important about these comparisons. Obviously, a color TV in 2009 and a color TV in 1973 were hardly the same thing. I'm old enough to remember 1973, what a color TV was like. It was small. The screen was small. The thing was huge, right? Maybe you had a remote control. You only got a handful of channels, right? It really wasn't the same thing we think about today. The picture quality was iffy, right? Today, when we think about a color TV, we don't even say color anymore because, of course, it's in color. But when we think about, say, a flat screen, say a 40-inch flat screen TV, a whole different thing, and it costs considerably less than the much weaker version of TVs did a generation ago. And you can again see similar numbers for all the other items here. If you look down that far right column, you can see the percentage change over the course of those 36 years there, right? The average of all those averages is about 71%. That is, the real cost of those standard household goods has fallen by 71%. It should not surprise us then to find out that as these goods have gotten cheaper, they've gotten more affordable for more people. And that's the story here, right? When we ask the question, are the poor getting poorer, right? The fact is the poor are getting much richer because the real cost of these goods have fallen so much that more and more people, including more and more poor people, can afford them. So for example, so this is from US Government Census Bureau data. And I should note, by the way, this is all US data. I know the Canadian data, it tells the same story. I know a little bit about the Western European data. It tells basically the same story. The different goods are different, obviously, things like that. But this is a fairly universal story across, again, advanced market economies. So what's interesting about this slide, a couple things that are interesting about this slide. This lets us look at poor people as a particular group and what percentage of poor households had those items in their household in those years. And I should note here too, this is poor as in below the poverty line. Sometimes we use quintiles and we're looking at the bottom 20%, but this is actually the bottom 12% or so in the United States, right? Folks who are below the poverty line. How likely are they to have these items in their house? And one of the things you can see is that over that roughly 20 years we're looking at here, that the percentage of poor households that had almost every one of these standard household kind of appliances and goods climbed. But the only exceptions to that, one interesting exception is the telephone, which began to fall off between 2003 and 2005. The obvious answer to that is explained two below with the rise of cell phone usage among poor households. If we looked at these same data today, I haven't seen the most recent, we expect these numbers again to continue to rise. Personal computers, even in 2005, 42% of poor American households had a personal computer. I love, again, that the VCR is on there. Who has a VCR anymore? Who has a Blu-ray? Nobody even has Blu-rays anymore, right? We download all of this stuff. So this sort of process of improvement has gone on and in a whole variety of different ways. A couple things to point out about this. One, sometimes people look at this slide and say, well, Steve, that's all just sort of, frivolous technology and so on. Well, no. Refrigerators and freezers keep food cold. They keep people healthy that way. They also enable people to buy in volume and store things up for later, which enables poor households to spend less money, engage in economies of scale, as we call it as economists, to spend less money per item. Air conditioners save lives. I don't need to tell a European audience that. Deaths from heat are a real problem worldwide, and especially places that don't have air conditioning. So air conditioning can be a lifesaver. And obviously, we think of cell phones as, all kinds of different things now, but the idea of having a mobile phone and being able to be reached at any time for people who are poor and who are looking for work, or people who are are homeless, having cell phone is a key piece of being able to get a house, get somewhere to live back, to get a job back, and so on. So those I don't think are trivial. I also want to say one thing about the cars, right? if you notice the data there, in 2001, about 73% of poor American households owned at least one car. And that's kind of amazing when you think about it. Now, as I'm going to talk about in a minute or two, they might not have been the best cars in the world. But there's a story about this I want to tell, which is some of you may know the book The Grapes of Wrath, where by John Steinbeck, where this family escapes the Dust Bowl by all getting in an old car and driving west to California. It's a tragic story, and it's an indictment of capitalism and so on. So the Russians in the 1940s decided to show the film version of it as propaganda. They put it in theaters, and they wanted Russian, Soviet citizens to see how terrible the United States was. Problem is, it backfired, because the Soviet audiences watched this movie, and one of their first reaction was, "Wait a second, poor American families have cars, right?" So it doesn't really work very well as a demonstration of the failures of capitalism. I'm looking at my time. I'll just throw this up and say a quick word about it. Sometimes people say, well, the middle class has been hollowed out, right? And all I'm going to say about this, if you look at that data on the right, it's true that there are fewer households in that 35,000 a year to 75,000 a year range. If that's the middle class, you're right. There's fewer middle class households than there used to be. But the reason for that is there's a lot more rich households than there used to be. Households 75 to 100K are up from about 10% to 11%. And look at households over $100,000 in income, more than double, from 8%, 8.5% of all households to slightly over 19. Notice too that the poorest households under 35,000 a year fell over that period. So again, people are sort of moving up through the income distribution here. So for most of human history, the difference between the rich and the poor was that the rich had things that the poor did not. Today, the difference, again, at least within advanced economies, is that the rich have more and better things than the poor, but both groups have largely the same things. The difference is the difference in quality, right? Or just quantity of those things, right? It's not a difference in being able to access them. So for example, Bill Gates has a house with air conditioning and heat and running water. He has appliances and cars. He has a cell phone. He has access to life-saving medical technology. So do most Americans. They just don't have as many cars or as nice a house and so forth as say, a wealthy person does. And that's a huge change in human history, right? It's not a matter of the haves and have-nots anymore. It's a matter of a large group that has and a small group that has more and better. The difference between a Mercedes and a Chevy is not as large as the difference between having a car and not having one. And the same goes for a mansion versus an apartment with AC and heat and running water. So when we think about that difference, right, between the rich and the poor, if any of you know Monty Python and the Holy Grail, you might, know the scene where the king comes traveling through and the people are digging in the dirt, right? If you know that scene is beautiful in a way, right, for understanding the difference back then between the rich and the poor. And note too, the rich were often rich because of political power, not because they had created value through the marketplace for others. So let me finish with a little bit of a sort of not thought experiment, but a little bit of context for some historical context here. And this uses some more recent data. So in 1963, which is the year before I was born, so it's not ancient history, but close. The average private sector hourly wage in the United States was $2.50. Suppose in 1963 you wanted to buy a typical home entertainment system. What would it look like? Well, there it is, right? A moderately priced, excellent stereo system. It was a turntable, of course, which are cool again in a way that they weren't for a long time, an amplifier, and two really bad speakers. Trust me, I used to have one of these in my house. They're really, really bad. What would it have cost? It was on sale notice for $379.95. Okay. It would have taken about 152 hours at $2.50 an hour to earn that. So you would have had to work, if you figure 40-hour work week, you would have had to work about 4 weeks, more or less a month, almost a month's worth of wages, not counting we're leaving taxes out of this for now, right? So a month's worth of wages to afford to buy this typical home entertainment system. What can 152 hours of work buy the average worker today? In October of 2018, so about 18 months ago, 152 hours at the then average wage of just about $23 an hour would be worth $3,467. So that's what all those hours of work would be worth. if you'd taken that money and walked into a Walmart in the United States in October of 2018, here's what you could have bought. And notice, right, this is October of 2018. I didn't up this for today. No, and also notice you have some money left over there, right? You got about $200 left over to buy other things with. Each one of those things today costs less than it did 18 months ago. There's new stuff. I mean, iPad, I just bought my stepdaughter a 7th generation iPad for about that same price. I got the extra memory, so it was a little bit more expensive. But all of those things have fallen, right? Or at least are better quality at the same price. And so this, right, versus that home entertainment system in 1963, here's what the same amount of work can buy you. We shouldn't be surprised when poor Americans have this kind of stuff in their house. It's just not that expensive anymore, and poor folks are able to live much better than they did years ago. The one thing I haven't talked about that I'll mention quickly, and I'm happy to talk about a little bit more if people want, right? Well, two things. Let me sort of put a challenge on the table. You might say, well, wait a second. There's some things, big topics, big expenses you didn't talk about, right? And I'm not going to just let that hang and see if you can identify what those might be, and we can talk about those. I'm going to give away one now. One of the things I haven't talked about here is advances in medical technology. Okay, and in fact that a lot of medical stuff is a lot cheaper than it used to be. I take beta blockers for high blood pressure. Beta blockers did not exist in 1973 in any meaningful way. Beta blockers are a very cheap and very effective medicine against high blood pressure that have very few side effects for the vast majority of people. They are incredibly cheap, and they have saved more lives. They have saved people from having to spend money on the illnesses that high blood pressure can cause by being able to treat that high blood pressure very effective. We can talk about antibiotics. We can talk about all kinds of other things that, despite all of the problems with the U.S. medical care system, and there are many, nonetheless, right, those innovations and the driving down of those costs and the driving up of the value of people's labor has meant that those treatments are more accessible to more people. More people are alive and healthy today, and more poor people are alive and healthy today than ever before, thanks, I think, to the same processes that we're talking about, in this case, taking place within healthcare. I think that's my last slide. So I'm going to stop my share. And that was just about 20 minutes on the nose. Good for me. And again, I'm happy to take questions. And again, if you want to identify what I didn't talk about, I'm happy to talk about those things too. So thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. So let me just jump in right there. You said there are items which increased in price,
Yep.
which in my estimation might be higher education.
That's one.
That's one, and housing.
That's two. And then the other.
That might be healthcare itself, right?
Yeah. Right. Those are the three biggies that people point to.
Right. And those like, I might be naive, but maybe it has something to do with the government's involvement in all those three areas.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's there's two things to talk about there. One is all three of those are, in fact, areas where government plays an enormous role and a significant role in driving up costs in a variety of different ways. Things like zoning restrictions and all these other kind of things make housing more expensive than it needs to be. And to the degree the housing crisis was generated by poor government policy, whether monetary policy or housing policy, that drive up in prices was there too. So certainly there's a significant government role in housing that we want to talk about. We can talk higher education. Obviously, government plays a significant role there. I think in the context of the United States, the big thing we talk about, one of the big things we talk about there is that governments have been so willing to lend to students. And when colleges see that lending has loosened up, they know they have more scope to increase their tuition rates and to add on, all the fun stuff that American colleges have. And suddenly college gets really expensive and people are burdened with debt. There's no doubt that college is more expensive because of that government involvement. I will say, though, that you have to be careful with the debt numbers you sometimes see around, because one of the big debt numbers, people say, of the people who have college debt, the average debt is X. Well, it turns out there's a lot of people who go to college in the United States that don't have debt, so they're not even in that accounting, right? There's a bunch of zeros. If you really want to say what's the average debt of all college students, it's not quite as large as that number makes it seem. So housing, education, and sort of healthcare, right? Again, in the U.S. context, we know that the mess that is our sort of the worst of all systems that we have in the United States.
Right.
Government drives up costs in a bunch of different ways through Medicare, and to some extent Medicaid, and now with so-called Obamacare. Government's role there has, as well as restrictions on who can perform what sorts of things. We think of as supply side restrictions, the fact that nurses can't compete with doctors in certain sorts of things, other restrictions on how insurance works across the different states. So there's all kinds of ways in which government plays a role. It would be easy for a libertarian to sort of stop there and say, well, see, right, well, government plays this big role. Therefore, those things, the reason they cost more is because we don't have as free a market as we do elsewhere. And you can even point to things in the market, in healthcare, for example, where markets are pretty free, like LASIK eye surgery is really cheap because insurance doesn't cover it, right? And so it's out of that whole system. And so the competition there is significant. If you've ever also, the other one I like to talk about is a vet service. Yeah. We have a dog, right? And the vet market is extremely competitive and extremely cheap. I mean, it's almost, there's some medicine we sometimes give the dog, right? I'm like, I think humans can take that too. I want to
Let's give it a go.
It's way cheaper. So yeah. So I think that's an important point. It would be easy to stop there, but I think there's another point about all three of these. The education one being the hardest to make this case. All three of those, education, housing, and medical care, are of much higher quality than they used to be. What you're paying for at the higher price is not the same thing you were paying for before. Now, people are going to say, higher education, Steve? You got to be kidding me, right? College used to be more rigorous. It used to be whatever. Perhaps. There's some subjectivity there. But one measure of the value of higher ed is what's the marginal value of a college degree over a high school degree. And that has increased over time. So what you're getting by the choice to go to college is on the margin more valuable compared to high school than it used to be. Whatever you think about the state of higher ed, right? From a financial perspective, it's a better deal than it used to be in terms of that return. Anyway, so maybe you're paying more, but maybe you're also getting more for it. Houses. The average American house is considerably bigger than it used to be. It has way more features. It's more likely to have air conditioning. It's more likely to have fire protection stuff. So it's a whole different animal made with better materials. It's more energy efficient than houses used to be. And again, we sort of talked about the medical care stuff. I mean, I'm also a cancer patient, and bottom line is 20 years ago, I'd be dead. I wouldn't even be here. And I'm, I'm not cured, but I'm feeling great, and I'm not quite in remission, and it's all good. But one of the reasons is the advance in medical technology and the quality of medical care, right? It's expensive, right? But it does things. So 2 points about medical care. A lot of stuff's cheaper, like basic medicine, which enables us to have funds to pay for the more expensive stuff. And the fact that all these consumer appliances and all that kind of stuff is cheaper means people have income left over to be able to extend their lives with medical care procedures, perhaps that were non-existent years ago and that are costly. So again, it's they look like exceptions, but they're just a little more complicated than that.
All right. In order for everybody to understand this inequality debate a little bit better, I would kind of shift a little bit towards the different definitions of inequality. I mean, you can compare consumption, you can compare income, and you can compare wealth.
Yep.
A lot of the talk has been about first of all income, but in the later years it has also become more about wealth.
Yeah.
What you basically showed that consumption gives a really good picture of the actual standard of living of those individuals, which we should actually look at.
Right.
But that is not present in public debate, right? What is the reason for that? Why is income inequality and wealth inequality pushed way more than consumption inequality?
Wow, that's a great question. I I don't know if anyone's ever asked. I've given this talk so many times, and I don't think I've ever been asked that question before. So I'm thinking on my feet a little bit. I have two possible answers off the top of my head. One's a little more cynical than the other. The cynical answer is that a lot of people know down deep that that poor people today live better lives than poor people did before, right? And I think they know that, and they sort of know if they looked at that too closely, it wouldn't make the point that they think they want to make. Okay. And so, and we think, income, the other thing is income is also sort of easier to measure and track. We can just look at tax data or other kinds of data and get all that. And I'm just related to that. And I think people don't make that connection that what really matters to how well off people are is what they're able to consume with the income that they have. They're just not thinking about what they're purchasing with that income. They say, well, income, there you go, right? And we don't have to think anymore about it. We don't have to go any farther because we've got the income point. I also think part of it is, this is why isn't it addressed in the public policy debates? Well, because it isn't addressed in the public policy debates in some sense, because it's, I've tried to get a voice in with this, and there's a lot of sort of literature in the professional economics literature that looks at consumption inequality and shows that it's not nearly as great as income or wealth inequality. To the degree, I think there's a general thing in the media, and especially the legacy media, where bad news sells better than good news. There's that great cartoon, right, of the front page of the newspaper with all the good news on it. 150,000 people out of poverty today, right? And no one died in an airplane crash today. The good news is all around us, right? It's just not news. It's just a feature of the world that we live in. So I think it's when something shows good news, I don't want to get into this too far, but think about if you look at CNN's coverage of COVID, right? You'd think that the world was aflame and falling apart, and it's all bad news, bad news, because that, if it bleeds, it leads, right? And there is genuinely bad news with COVID, but there's also good signs too. And I think it's just people find bad news. They want to believe bad news more than good news for reasons that I think are deep in our psychology. I think we evolved to be alert to danger. That's how you survive. And I think the sort of, our amygdalas and our primitive parts of our brain, right, just get a dopamine hit when our being alert to danger is ratified by what we see out there. That's a great question. That's the best I can do.
All right. When we talk about income inequality and stuff like that, there is pretty consistent data on that for over the last 100 years probably in the US. And do you think that there is a lack of distinction between inequality and poverty?
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I do. And I think it's not like a purposeful deception. It's just that people assume that growing inequality means that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. So if things are getting more unequal, it must be that the least well off are worse off than they used to be. I think that's just like a tacit assumption people have.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important, as I'm thinking, as students and young professionals, as you get into these debates with people on social media or at the bar, when we can go to bars again, or wherever, right? That this is one of the challenges I think you got to put down from the beginning. In fact, if someone wants to look for it, I have a piece that I did, I think it was at fee.org called 4 Questions About Inequality or something like that, which so one of them is sort of things you want to start conversations with. If someone wants to Google that, you should be able to find it pretty easily. But one of them is to make this point, is to stop the person and say, are we really talking about inequality, or are we talking about poverty? Because those aren't the same things. The visual I sometimes use is, would you rather live in a world where the distribution of income was really tight like this, right? Here's the poor, here's the rich. Or would you rather live in this world, right? It's much more unequal, but the poor are doing much better. So which one do you want to talk about? if you're concerned about poverty, let's talk about poverty. If you're concerned about inequality, let's talk about inequality. But you can't, it's not automatic that increasing inequality means increasing poverty, or that the poor are getting worse off. Just for example, looking at the global data on how we have pushed back against global poverty in the last 10 or 20 years, right? The percentage of the world that is under $1 or $2 a day has dropped dramatically. Again, pre-COVID, same problem we have with the Great Recession, but certainly over the long haul, that's been quite clear. Another great book to read on this, if folks haven't read it yet, is Hans Rosling's, may he rest in peace, Factfulness, a terrific book, which has all this great data about global incomes and so on. So again, I think all of this stuff is people want to believe the bad story. A libertarian cynic might say, well, because they all want state power and they all want to, use right. So maybe, but that's my last resort, right? My first resort is to say, let's see what you're really talking about here, and get clear whether it's inequality or poverty.
Yeah, especially once you look at movies which have come out in the last decade, pretty much, starting with Inequality for All by Robert Reich, who's basically talking about poverty, actually,
right,
in the first hour of the movie, and portrays it as inequality.
Right.
I mean, he's talking about people living paycheck to paycheck, and there was no basic connection of their daily lives and the daily lives of rich people, and how those might interact at any point, which they kind of really don't, because the rich being rich don't make the poor poorer.
That's right.
But when it comes to inequality, I see basically two extreme positions. I see inequality is the defining issue of our century, which is a quote uttered by many politicians, and also we have inequality does not really matter.
Yeah,
and in my opinion, there is supposed to be a middle ground, because I do think that it matters how this inequality arises.
Yes.
What is your take on those extreme positions?
Well, yeah. So there's a couple of interesting things there. Let me take your last point first. I think it absolutely does matter how inequality arises. Measured inequality that arises from people earning incomes in market economies. The fact that Jeff Bezos is fabulously rich, we're so much better off for that, right? And the sort of the social gains from his wealth are enormous. One study by the now Nobel Prize winning William Nordhaus economist said that the innovators keep only 2% of the total gains from their innovations. So if you think about Bezos, you could sort of say, multiply his profits, his Amazon's profits, or Bezos's income by 50, right? And you get a sense of the value he's created for other people. It's probably higher for Amazon. So yes, by contrast, right, inequality that takes place through things like rent seeking and getting various government privileges, right, or other manipulations of the political process, where the income gain is not a positive sum game, but rather at best a zero sum and probably a negative sum game, right? That's more problematic. I mean, one question we can ask, and this is the question that a philosopher like Rawls, it's a sort of version of Rawls, which is inequality. The one way to justify inequality is to ask whether it works to the benefit of the least well off, or whether in some sense it works to the benefit of all of us, right? I mean, those are the justifications we might have for greater inequality. If greater inequality is just benefiting those who are at the top of that now more unequal distribution, then it's no good. So I think you're right. And I have a paper with Vincent Geloso in the Independent Review a couple of years ago called Inequality First Do No Harm, something like that looks at exactly this question about the sources of inequality. That's available on the web if someone wants to hunt it down and put the link in chat. So I think that's one thing here. I think one of the other questions I think from that fee piece was, what exactly is the problem with inequality? Why is inequality bad? I think that's a question we don't ask enough. I think we just assume it's bad, right? But why is it bad? If you take the sort of Bezos example, right, and if the inequality is coming out of economic growth and people producing value for others, and I think if there's, whatever significant means, but significant degree of income mobility, that is, people who are poor really do have the opportunity to move up, and people who are at the top really do, aren't locked in by political privilege. If you have income mobility and you have markets being the driver of people's incomes, what exactly is the problem with inequality? Now, oftentimes when you argue, have this conversation with people on the left, they will say something, well, rich people have more political power, right? Can have better access to political power. That's true, right? But what's the problem there, right? Is the problem the fact that they're rich and created value for us, or is the problem that the political sector has so much power that people want to access it, right? You can solve that problem by shrinking the sphere of political power, and that way, rich people, we'd like to live in. I think one way for libertarians to put this is, we'd like to live in a world where the only way rich people can get power, and the only way wealth and power are connected, is that you get economic power by creating wealth for other people, right? By creating value for other people. I mean, Jeff Bezos has, I think we don't talk about, libertarians don't often use the phrase economic power, but Bezos has it, whatever it means, he has it, right? But it's okay, I think, right? For the most part, it's been earned by making us better off. The only power he has is the power we've given him by buying his stuff. And I love it when I see, my sort of progressive students complaining about rich people, right, as they use their Mac that they got at Amazon, right, and made sort of not so much Steve Jobs anymore, but made the Apple execs rich in the process, made Bezos and the Amazon, right? You made these people rich by your own choices. So I think that's part of the response there. But again, distinguishing between inequality and poverty, asking what the sources of inequality are, and asking what exactly is the problem with inequality, I think are really important. And too often in these conversations, people just assume inequality is bad, period, end of sentence. And people don't think about the different sources. Those great. Yeah, I think those are great observations.
Can we talk about some of the sources which are legitimate and which are unlegitimate? Yeah. For example, like there's a huge, when we talk about wealth inequality, there's a huge asset price inflation, pretty much starting from the 80s. In my research, I did like I indexed wages and also the S&P 500, and it's just crazy how much the prices increased in stocks and stuff. Right. What's your take on?
Well, right. I mean, to the degree that that's being driven by Federal Reserve and other central bank policy, right? That's a problem, and it's a good example of how people with wealth and economic power can easily translate that into political power to get political institutions to do things that benefit them, that are regressive, that help the rich more than they help the poor, or actively harm the poor. So certainly, and there's debate among economists, but to the degree that monetary policy has generated that asset inflation, and that has disproportionately helped the well-off, yes, that's certainly a source of wealth inequality. I'll give you another one too. In the United States, right, home ownership is one of people's biggest sources of wealth, is whether or not they own a home and what size home and so on. And certainly, as an explanation in the United States of the wealth inequality by race, the fact that U.S. government policy for decades, as policy, not just sort of private discrimination, but as government policy, made it really difficult for African Americans to purchase homes or to purchase homes that would rise in neighborhoods that would enable them to rise in value. Yeah. Right. The generational effects of that are huge. And it's one reason why white families on average have much more wealth than Black families do. That difference in access to housing is huge. There's a terrific book by Richard Rothstein. I think it's Richard's first name. Rothstein, anyway. Maybe it's Ron. Rothstein, The Color of Law, that looks at the history of U.S. housing policy from this racial angle. He's no libertarian, but wow, is it a libertarian book when you realize just how much damage that policy's done. So those are two examples of policy sources. Let me actually put another thing on the table here too. And this is a point Geloso and I make in that independent review paper. the way we measure inequality sometimes makes things look worse than they really are. Demographic changes, they don't account for demographic changes. So the increase in divorce that's created, if you have two, husband and wife, each earning $50,000 a year, making $100,000 as a household, they're a rich household, right? They get divorced. Now you have two households at 50,000 each. Just ignore alimony and all that. Two households at 50,000 each, right? Suddenly it looks like inequality's gotten worse. But do we want to call that an increase in inequality? And if we do we think it's a bad thing? I mean, the divorce might be bad. It might be that this couple is much better off not living with each other anymore. So that's a demographic thing. Also, we count households, and the number of people per household has changed over time. Households are smaller than they used to be. And poor households are much smaller than rich households. So when we look at, one of the things we might want to do is to not just look at household income, but look at household income per capita, meaning what's the income per person in the household. Because it turns out in rich households, that income stretches across more people. The number of Americans who live in rich households is much greater than the number of Americans who live in poor households, even if we divide it into the quintiles. There's the same number of households in the top 20% as the bottom 20%.
Right.
The number of people in those households is different. So, there's and it put that with the consumption data too, right? So people who we're all living better, right? And certainly people at the top are living particularly better. And there's more people at the top. I meant the middle class data rather, right? Not the consumption data. So again, that's another. When I did this talk, the whole talk, I make up an English word that really doesn't exist. I said, my point in this talk is to complexify this issue, right? I don't, I'm not denying that inequality exists or even denying that it's gotten worse, but it's more complicated than the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poor. That's just so oversimplified. And the real story is much more complicated. And that should make us humble about radical policies to address inequality when the issue is so complicated.
Yeah, as Europeans, we wouldn't have noticed if you just made up words.
That's why I haven't. You steal all our words into your language anyway, certainly if you're French.
Well, yeah, we're Germans. We're not safe from that anyway.
Yeah,
that's a different debate. When we talk about the consequences of inequality, especially in policy debates, the consequences of inequality sound dramatic. I recently read a book which blames infant mortality, which basically does like simple regression models on inequality, and it has horrific outcomes such as decreased life expectancy, infant mortality, happiness, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Those don't really hold up to scrutiny. But what holds up more is the social unrest, the social uneasiness people feel with relative poverty or inequality.
Yep.
What should libertarians think of that?
It's so let me just make sure. So the argument is, right, people, even if people agree that they are better off in absolute terms, the fact that they look at really wealthy people and perceive as though they've fallen behind in relative terms, that makes them frustrated, and they think inequality is rising. They think things are worse off. That sort of argument. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that's first of all, I think as libertarians, we shouldn't be denying that it's true that people think that way, right? I mean, it's a survey fact. It's a fact of people's attitudes. I suspect that the source of this is, again, a kind of, evolved notion that because someone else is getting better off, in some way we are being made worse off. It's really hard for human beings to accept positive sum games. We're just, again, life for most of us, for the hundreds of thousands of years we've been vaguely human, was in environments that were not positive sum, right? That interactions with other people were threats, and that especially interactions with strangers We're also used to living in, for most of our biological history, living in groups that were communal and redistributive, that were kin-based. So we're used to thinking, treating everyone like a brother or sister, right? Is what we do. And so we just, the notion that we all benefit from pursuing our self-interest, and that pursuit of self-interest is mutually beneficial, right? Is positive sum, is a really difficult thing for people to get their heads, or many people to get their heads around. Nothing of their own fault. They're not smart. We're just programmed. Evolution has, sort of given us the disposition to be skeptical of that. It's the hardest thing about teaching economics, by the way, right? Is to get people over that hump, because that's fundamental to understanding economics, right? And so, it's even a small victory for me when my students begin to understand that exchange is mutually beneficial and there's unintended consequences, right? And all the sort of basic stuff we think about. So I think that's part of the libertarian response, is to say, look, I no doubt that you feel as though somehow, you're being harmed by this, but you're not. I mean, you're not. And the same processes that produce, this movement, right? That everyone's doing better, but relative inequality is worse, right? It's the process that's making everybody better off. And I think it's important to point to income mobility, and to also say, it's not the case that people who are poor in 1 year are all poor still in 5 years or 10 years. And you can say, even if it's this, even if poor people are better off, absolutely, it is also true that the people who are poor in 1 year are not poor in 5 years or 10 years. So the ability to move out of poverty, even as in absolute terms, poverty is less horrible, right, is really there. And people from the top fall too, not as often as people from the top, right? So I think that's one libertarian response here. I mean, I think there's another kind of response, which is to say, and you have to be really careful how you do this one, because it's easy to get snarky with it. But to say to folks who are worried about relative poverty, look at the rest of the globe for a minute. Right. You live in North America or Western Europe, Australia, Japan, wherever, right? There are people around the world who would risk their lives and do every day to have even half of your standard of living in the United States. And when we think about, sort of global equality, global inequality, right? It's way worse elsewhere. And the ability of, your poor Americans are still in the top 5 or 10% worldwide, right? Income worldwide. So again, there's relative poverty and there's relative poverty. And there's one other response too, which is, okay, what do you want to do about it? Right? Even if this relative increase in relative poverty, or relative inequality rather, offends you, bothers you, what would you do about it? Would you pass redistributive, legislation that redistributes? And then we can talk about why that's going to be problematic, right? We can also talk about, if in general, if you're going to give government more power, who's going to have access to it? Not you, right? It's those guys, the guys you're envious of, right? You're the one who's concerned about the inequality and sort of saying how much power they have. Who's going to get state power if you use state power to try to solve this problem? So, we live in imperfect. I think part of the response is we live in imperfect worlds, and both, the reality of political solutions is they don't work the way we draw them up on the blackboard. And I think that's an important point in general for us to make, for libertarians to make, about other people's proposed political solutions.
Yeah, I think a related question from the chat is, when government proclaims that they fight poverty, is it real, or is it just reducing inequalities and basically just doing redistribution?
Yeah, so our government policy is doing this, right?
Exactly.
I think it's a great question. It's not, I don't know particular data on that, but certainly it seems plausible that strongly redistributive policies might well reduce inequality at the cost of making everyone worse off. I'm a big fan of the rock band Rush. If you know their song, "The Trees," right? All at the end, trees were all kept equal by hatchet, axe, and saw. Right? It's one way to keep everybody equal is to mow everybody down. I'm not that it's a little hyperbolic, but certainly to the degree that those redistributive policies prevent economic growth too. Right? The benefits of economic growth go across the board, right? Poor people benefit from it, and that's certainly been the secret in other parts of the world too. So yeah, redistributive policies may it might appear to reduce inequality while at the same time making absolute poverty worse. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, there's also in the research there is the claim that increased inequality reduces economic growth as a whole. Is there any evidence for that? Because there have been like multiple theories about why that is the case, and there's a lot of conflicting studies out there. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I don't see it. Right. I mean, it's interesting. People say, well, increased inequality reduces economic growth, but they also sometimes say, look at all the rich countries where inequalities got worse. Right. So right. I mean, one of the things I would expect as countries get richer, here's another little statistical thing to keep in mind too. As countries get richer, measured inequality is going to look worse. Okay. And this is, I'm going to use my hands again for the visual here. So if you think about measuring inequality by quintiles, by the 20, dividing the income distribution into 20% hunks. Okay. And one of the things we ask is how easy is it for people to move in between those quintiles? How easy is it for poor people to come up 1 or 2 or 3 quintiles? And we can measure that, right? And if you look at the data, it's gotten harder to do that over time. It's been hard. Income mobility in the United States has fallen over time. Now, there might be some, there's all kinds of possible reasons for that. And some of them might be benign, some of them might be problematic. But as an economy grows, as a society gets richer, the size of each of those quintiles grows. It's like pulling open an accordion, right? And so the size of each quintile grows. Therefore, it takes more of an increase in income to leap out of one quintile and into another. We would expect to see somewhat lower mobility as growth happens because the quintiles get wider. But 2 things, right? One, consumption. Second, if we looked at absolute income gains, right? It might have been that poor people 20 years ago could pretty easily make $20,000 more a year after 5 years, and that would have leapt them up a quintile. Well, it might be the case today. They're making $20,000 in real dollars, right, over 5 years, but that's not enough to leap them out of the quintile. It looks like inequality has grown, but right, the poor people are doing the same as they were before. So again, there's all complexify, right? There's all kinds of complexities here that we want to think about. So yeah, I mean, I think that I don't see the evidence for how increased growth increased inequality holds back economic growth. I just don't see it. And the problem with that argument too is it starts from the wrong end. Why is inequality growing? Right? We can't explain the impact on economic growth unless we have a sense of why inequality is growing. Just sort of starting from the growth and inequality doesn't provide us a really satisfying explanation.
Yeah, I mean, there's also some large evidence that inequality is reduced by free markets, especially in the time frame between 80 and 2005.
Yep. Yeah, and again, it depends on and it often depends on exactly what you're measuring and how you're measuring it. And yes.
There's a question from the chat which I find very interesting. Can or should be the definition of poverty be extended to the absence of certain rights or capabilities of one individual within society relative to the rights and capabilities of another, individual in that group?
Yeah. Right. So, I mean, one could develop a kind of capabilities notion of poverty and say that poverty is not just about economic, whether it's income or wealth or consumption or whatever, and say that. I think that and sort of include those other sorts of things. I think there's a couple of problems with that. One is what to include on that list. And then is it really true that there's, well, let me put it this way. What you include on that list might be relevant for what for what exactly it is you're measuring, and whether or not it's true, right? That different groups have different access to those things. So I think the devil's in the details there, right? What do you want to put on that list, and what's the goal, right? Why call that poverty? We might want to call it something else. Yep. Right? The fact that some people have less education than others is a problem, but do we need to call that poverty to try to find ways to address it? I think maybe that's a way to put it. And before we take the next question, I want to answer Adam's question in the chat on whether the Red Wings will win another Stanley Cup. The answer is yes, but it's going to take a while. So I just want to get that out of the way for Adam.
That was the most important question.
Actually. It was the most important question.
That might be a little bit.
Hey, hockey's back August 1st. Even though my Red Wings are out of this thing, and there's not going to be any fans, I'm thrilled to have hockey back.
Yeah, that might be a little anticlimactic now, but hey. So let's talk about something more positive on a more light note. Let's talk about solutions.
Yeah.
If we agree that inequality has there is inequality which needs to be solved, what are the solutions to that? I mean, it's closely connected to the sources of inequality, obviously, right?
Yeah.
But what are the solutions?
So I'm tempted to say, are we talking about inequality or are we talking about poverty, right? And I think, some of the solutions might well be the same, okay? I mean, to the degree that if we distinguish between sort of benign, innocent growth and inequality, or even beneficial growth and inequality, and the problematic growth and inequality, I mean, the best thing we can do let's stay with inequality, right? We want to reducing the state's footprints in the economy, I think, has two potential benefits. One, it takes away the ability of people with wealth and power to lock that wealth and power in by using the state to do it, right? There was just in the news yesterday in the United States, there's a big bribery scandal in the state of Ohio where the Speaker of the House, a Republican of the Ohio legislature, sort of put himself up for sale to bail out a nuclear plant, and these other guys paid him this $60 million bribe to do it, right? So, I mean, again, that kind of stuff, when you have the power to regulate that way, people with wealth and power are going to seek it out. So if one of the things we want to do is to cut down on the ability of people with wealth and power to lock it in, right? We need to get the state out of the business of intervening in the economy as much as possible. And I think one of the great levelers, one of the great forces against inequality is competition, right? And the more competition that we have, the less we worry about measures of inequality. Competition generates the churn and creative destruction and all those sorts of things that helps to ensure that the only way you can stay rich and the only way inequality is going to grow is if you're delivering value for people, and that we don't worry about, I think, or at least don't worry about as much. And we can do the same thing at the other end of the spectrum, right? I mean, one of the reasons that poor people find it difficult to get out of poverty to the extent that they do, and one of the things we can do to speed up the process of how well the poor do, is to start to eliminate economic regulations that disproportionately impact the poor. Minimum wage laws are the obvious one we talk about all the time, but we can talk about occupational licensure, right? The fact if you need a license to engage in certain occupations, that makes it very difficult for poor folks to enter. Notice reduces competition and therefore increases inequality. Okay, that's one. I would like to see competition in the school system in the United States, some form of school choice, right? That enables more poor families to get better education. So that's another way in which getting government out of the marketplace can help. And perhaps most importantly, ending the war on drugs, which again disproportionately harms poor people. And people of color in the United States. I mean, this is where all the things we're going through. I had an African American colleague at my former job who used to say about drug arrests. He says, down at the courthouse, there's no justice, there's just us, right? And that white folks and in general rich folks are able to skirt the drug laws in ways that poor folks and people of color are not, in addition to the violence and all the other damage that those laws do. So there's a, and we talk about housing and zoning and that stuff too, right? All of these things that interfere with the opportunity of poor Americans, and particularly poor Americans of color, to pursue entrepreneurial opportunities, to start businesses, to move themselves up, to acquire human capital through the school system, and so on. I know someone asked earlier in the chat, I just happened to glance at what my take is on Brian Kaplan's education stuff. And so let me just say two things real quick. One, even if Brian's right, my point earlier about the value of a college degree still holds. The value just is signaling, just not human capital, right? So that Brian's argument, I think, doesn't matter for my previous point. I'm a, my own view is I'm a little bit more, there's no doubt signaling plays a huge role. But I am also convinced that at least a good education, a good liberal education, adds to your human capital, and that matters also. No doubt signaling is huge, but I don't think human capital is irrelevant.
When it comes to education, there is inequality in the access to education. Mm-hmm. And what are the chances that the free market provides for that? Are we talking about MOOCs, for example, or how do we do this?
Yeah, I think there's all kinds of ways. I mean, old-fashioned sort of school choice, letting people take their tax dollars and spend it as they want would be huge. And it's fascinating what's happening in the U.S. right now with COVID and school reopenings, right? Yeah. The school choice movement has never had a better opportunity here to say, look, you guys are supposed to be providing a service. Teachers are getting paid. People are being taxed, yet you're not opening. That's not fair. As a friend of mine says, if Walmart took your money but didn't give you anything, you'd be outraged. So, the push to sort of get school districts to instead just give families funds and let them decide how to do it, we might see more of that. And people are forming these little mini co-ops where handful of families are getting together and hiring a teacher or a tutor to homeschool. I mean, there's all kinds of, as you say, sort of market solutions to these problems. You can think about this the same way that Uber and Lyft worked around the taxi monopolies, right? Didn't abolish them, just found a different way to do it. And I think we're gonna see some of that too. All of that said, right, I think it's important for libertarians to not oversell. The fact is that even in the free society we imagine, the reality is that people with wealth are going to have better stuff than people who have less wealth. It just is, right? So rather than worry about whether or not opportunities are equal in some strict sense of the term, I think this is where we say, how well off are the least well off doing? Right? What educational opportunities are available to the poorest households, and are those increasing over time? Right? And I think here, by the way, back to the earlier question, here's where we can sort of bring a capabilities perspective in and say, are the educational opportunities available to the least well off still sufficient to develop their capabilities in a way that enables them to be productive and contributing citizens? That's a legitimate question to ask. And the answer from a libertarian perspective might be, yeah, free markets do that well enough. It's just going to be the case that for poor folks, it's never going to be the same education. And they're never going to drive the same cars, right? And they're never going to fly first class as often as, right? I mean, that just is. And that's why I think, one, we look at how well is the bottom doing and is it increasing? And two, how much mobility is there? I don't want a world, and I don't think a free society would be a world in which people at the top are locked into the top. That's exactly the thing. And I'll make a note here because I'm working on a little piece about this. The ability to lock in your wealth and to lock in your status that way was what 19th century and many 20th century classical liberals, libertarians called privilege. And I think that word has been grabbed for something else now. And that's a real thing. What people talk about now is privilege, the sort of unstated assumptions and all that, and the explicit benefits one gets from being in particular groups. All true. I'm not sure privilege is the best word for it. And I don't want us to lose that word. If you read Adam Smith, if you read John Stuart Mill, you see that word privilege all over the place. If you read Hayek, if you read Constitution of Liberty, he talks about how what the liberal view is one that opposes privilege. And by privilege, he talks about how that word means private law, priv and leisure, private law, that some people are benefiting from the law in ways that others aren't. And it violates what Hayek calls the generality norm of law. And I think it's okay for us to use the word privilege to describe the things that we oppose, and that what we want is a society without that kind of privilege. And I think if we think about it that way, we begin to see how a free society, while it will never be a perfectly equal society, the opportunities for all to move up and down will be maximized as much as we can.
All right. When we're talking about, I think we're almost talking strategy now, how to sell our ideas.
And rhetoric is important, man.
Yeah.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Well, one thing, and then I'll let you ask your question. Yeah. I've been around libertarians since about 1979 or 1980. And as a rule, we're terrible salespeople for our own ideas.
That is true.
We're terrible. And we need to be better. And just as one example, I mean, the U.S. Libertarian presidential candidate, Joe Jorgensen, right, tweets Black Lives Matter, right? And we need to be anti-racist. There's nothing unlibertarian about that. I mean, the organization Black Lives Matter has lots of positions that libertarians don't like, but has lots that we should too. So, all right. But some libertarians go berserk. Oh, she's a commie or whatever. So yeah, we're terrible and we need to be better. We're getting better. You guys, right. I think Students for Liberty has been part of getting better. Bleeding Heart Libertarian Movement has been part of getting better, right? But we're still not nearly as good as we need to be.
Well, my initial question was about how do we sell ourselves when it comes to eliminating inequality. We said that we should not oversell. We should not oversell the capabilities of the market. Right. Would we then shift the focus more on the inability of governments to actually reduce inequality, because government spending has been growing consistently while inequality has been growing also.
Yes. So yeah, I could do an hour and a half on this question alone. I think it's always a good rhetorical strategy to ask, can government do what you want it to do? Right? What assumptions are you making about the people in government that lead you to believe they'll actually do what you want them? How many examples have you, I mean, you're talking to someone, how many examples have you pointed out to me over the years in our conversations, right, about where government screwed things up and now suddenly they're going to do this right?
Yep.
And do you really want to you're the one who tells me that rich, white, whatever folks have all the power. And do you want to give them more? Right? And I think that's why talking about things like competition as being equalizers and sort of pushbacks against power is really important. And talking about how we oppose privilege is really important too. Look, I think what we can say is we'll never have a world without inequality. Some people will always have more than others. The question is, how'd they get it? And did that benefit other people when they got it? And is the ability to acquire it by other people still a meaningful one? I mean, those are the questions. I think we make a mistake if we try to deny that inequality exists or perhaps has gotten bigger. I think we can point to the consumption data and talk about relative versus absolute. But even there, right, it's not like you're denying inequality. And I think sort of distinguishing the benign sources of inequality and the more problematic ones are important too. It's complicated. And it's just the frustration is sometimes getting beyond the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. And it doesn't help libertarians any to respond to that with equally simplistic slogans, about the market, right? The old joke, right? How many libertarians does it take to change a light bulb? None. The market will do it, right? I mean, that's not an answer, right? But I really do want to stress the point about political failure, right? And pointing out, asking those questions about, okay, look, I'll agree with you. In fact, here's really the best way to do it is to say with this, I'm talking to a progressive friend, I agree with you. Look, markets aren't perfect. I'm not arguing they're perfect. There'll be inequality, right? People have different access to education. We won't, sellers will produce crappy goods sometimes. They're not perfect, but neither is government, right? And the question is, which one is less imperfect, and how do we judge that? And what reasons do we have for thinking that markets will, despite their imperfections, that people in markets will get the signals and the incentives they need to correct their errors in the right sorts of ways, and compared to politics. I think those are those comparative institutional questions, comparing imperfect institutions, right? That's where the battleground is. And we come across, I think, more reasonably when we do that, rather than, sort of saying, oh, the market will take care of it. What does that mean?
Related to that, is there a misunderstanding of what the market actually is?
Yeah, I think there is.
Because it's seen as this, magical thing, which is not really tangible, but
it's people, right?
It's just people.
It's market is people, and I actually try to discourage my students, right, from using those sort of disembodied terms, right? Because when we say the market tends towards equilibrium, or the market corrects this, no, what we mean is entrepreneurs and consumers are making choices based on the signals of the marketplace that lead this happen. There's real people in there making real choices based on real things. I also think the other problem is there's this thing, even among, I think some libertarians, to say things like, well, it's good for the economy. I don't care about the economy. It's a construct, right? I care about people. So don't tell me it's good for the economy. Explain to me how it's good for people, and particularly how it's good for the least well off. I'd like that answer too. So saying something, my students do this all the time. It's good for the economy when people do X. No, I don't care about the economy, right? Or worse, it's good for profits when people do X. No, I don't care about profits per se. I think it's fine to make profits if you're producing something that's benefiting people, but we don't put profits over anything else. I think there's all kinds of misunderstandings about those kinds of things. And I think understanding the sort of Hayek point that markets are ultimately communication systems. I like to call them, epistemic ecologies, right? They're ecologies of knowledge and systems of knowledge and knowledge communication. Understanding that, right, and beginning to ask, the question you should always ask is, how do you know? How would you know? That's another good question to ask from people who want to give government more power to do particular things. How do you know? How do you know that Amazon's too big? How do you know what the right number of firms and right size of firms should be in that market? How do you know? Right? How do you know what the right growth in the money supply is? Right? There's your anti-central bank argument. Right? So how do you know? And I think that's an interesting question for people on the progressives to have to answer and sort of think about.
I do think that it has always helped me to point out that, the first step should be to make clear that we are the markets and we are not the government.
Yeah.
There is the exact opposite. There's the exact opposite notion in real life, because we participate in markets every day.
That's right.
If we do, elect people, if we do participate in elections, we do that every 4 days, 4 years, 5 years.
Right.
And then it's not really comes down to our vote.
Yeah.
So this is in my estimation the most powerful thing.
No, I think that's great. I think that's great. And a sort of corollary of that is that markets are able to satisfy minority tastes.
Exactly.
In ways that politics aren't, right? All of, when you're arguing with your, say, progressive friends, all of whom are interested in these sort of really niche music or niche film things, right? Or whatever, right? And markets have given them a world in which they can listen to their, Swedish / metal, all done by women, right? In a way that you can't possibly get that kind of precise preference satisfaction out of government. Government is, you vote for a party, you get a hunk of a deal. You don't get that same precision. So so markets are us, and markets respond to us in very precise ways that make it possible to satisfy our preferences much more perfectly than we do in politics. That's right.
There's another question from the chat. The last one, actually. Does maybe the Peltzman effect explain the recent rise in inequality in the advanced countries as economy moves towards service sector? I have to be ignorant what the Peltzman.
I know what the Peltzman. I'm not sure what the connection here is. Bada, can you say a little more about that in the chat?
It's actually from YouTube, so it's
Oh, it
not
was
from
okay.
the
Okay.
auto. So we might have to wait
Oh,
for that
okay. Yeah,
answer a
yeah.
little
All
bit.
right. Yeah, I'm just yeah. Uh yeah, because I'm just curious. I'm not. I mean, I know what the Peltzman effect is. I just don't see. I don't see the connection that question is sort of supposing is there. What is it that's happening in the? Yeah. Oh, this is a good question. I'm looking at the one that just popped in too.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
shall I read it out? I will
Yeah.
read it
Yeah.
out.
Go ahead.
What are other topics libertarians can talk about more frequently that will make us appear less cold and analytic and more empathetic and understanding? Because in my humble opinion, even the sensible part of the movement have a marketing problem with that.
So right. So we've talked about, race has come up inevitably here as we've talked about poverty and inequality. And I think, a friend of mine said to me just yesterday, actually, on a classical liberal friend on Facebook said libertarians ought to be winning on the race issue. Right. And he was thinking of things like the housing policy stuff and all that. I think, and I think our long history of classical liberals being, anti-slavery, pro-equality. I mean, Mill is a great example there. And Adam Smith too. So I think we can emphasize when it comes, we can talk more about race, not be afraid to talk about race. We have a legitimate history, good history on race. It actually gets worse in the 20th century. It's a little harder, stuff that the paleos and people have said would make it worse. But I think if you sort of stick to the long history of classical liberalism, we can talk about race, and we can agree with folks on the left that we should be concerned about racial inequality and disparities. We can talk about ways that they're real. And that they're institutional and in some sense structural. I think we can agree with that too. We don't have to say it's not that racism is a problem because people are racist. There are policies and institutions and structures that, even if our hearts are in the right place, still generate racist outcomes in racial inequality. So I think agreeing with all that, but saying we just see differently what those structures and institutions are, and then having that conversation. The other one, of course, is gender. While we're at it too, right? I mean, I wrote a whole book on the family, and I think talking about the ways in which government policy has historically discriminated against women. There's all kinds of interesting stuff there from labor markets at the turn of the same story you can tell about how the progressives intervened in labor markets and harmed folks of color in the early 20th century. Yep. Same story is true of women. The story that not enough people know about in the United States is the way in which U.S. income tax law is biased against secondary earners, which more often are women than men. And that was a feature, not a bug in the 1940s. It was designed to keep women at home. And I think so that's another thing that we can talk about. We can talk about the ways in which markets have eaten away at the gender wage gap, and how the gender wage gap is. We can say, it's not the labor market that generates the gender wage gap, but it's perhaps sexism and other kinds of places. And I think we have to be also recognize that markets can't solve every problem. Markets can't make all of racism and sexism go away. I think you do have to work on the culture. You do have to, convince people that it's okay for women to go into STEM fields, and it's okay for men to take care of kids at home, right? Those are things we should be talking. There's no reason we can't talk about those things. And one of the great things about being a libertarian is we were so far ahead of the game on LGBTQ, et cetera, issues. The U.S. Libertarian Party had a gay rights plank in it from the beginning in the early 70s. Libertarians were the only people talking about same-sex marriage for a long time. And even, you look at things that people on the left said, Democratic politicians in the United States were against same-sex marriage till the very end, right? Yep. Libertarians have a great history on this stuff, and we should be taking up rights of sex workers. We should be taking up trans rights. We should be taking about all these kind of things. Again, we're not going to see it exactly the same way as the left is, but we have a legitimate claim to it. Okay. I'm looking now at the YouTube question. So when countries move from agriculture to manufacturing, they experience growth, but accompanied by an inequality that falls as time passes by. I'm not sure what the Peltzman effect is there, but it's true that inequality was worse early on in the Industrial Revolution, for example, and that it falls over time. So are we? Well, and when we see the same moving from manufacturing to service, we might, right? I mean, it might be the case that service people who are in the service industry, a move to a service economy generates more super high income jobs. There's more jobs, more ways you can get rich in entertainment, more ways you can get rich,
finance,
sports, right, and all these sorts of things, right? So there's and in fact, maybe CEOs too. So there's more stuff at the high end, and maybe we'll see that level out over time. Interesting question. It could be that we'll see the same pattern where over the longer haul, some of those differences we're seeing today will even out. I do think the key though is mobility. Can you get up and down in reasonable ways?
All right. We have no further questions, actually. Okay. This talk was scheduled for 90 minutes, and we don't want to take more of your time.
No, this is fun. This has been great. It's been great to be I mean, the questions have been terrific, and this is a favorite talk of mine to give, and I think as these last set of questions suggest, right? I think there's a real hunger among libertarians, particularly young libertarians, to think about how we can meaningfully enter these conversations that are happening among our progressive friends in ways that are productive and are sensitive and humane in all the ways that one question pointed out. And so I'm always happy to talk about that, because I spent 27 years at a small liberal arts college with a lot of colleagues who were exactly that. And sort of having, you learn how to have these conversations, and you learn to take them seriously and take them in good faith, and find ways to muscle our way in.
All right. Can you talk about again about the articles? Can you direct us to the articles which?
The inequality ones.
A
couple of that off the top of my head. Horwitz and Vincent Geloso in the Independent Review, 2017 maybe. It's called Inequality First, Do No Harm. If you Google that title, you'll get it. So that's one. The short piece from Fee was something like 4 questions about inequality. I think if you Google Horwitz questions, inequality, and Fee, you'll find it. There's a paper of mine on which the longer version of this talk is based, which is published in a journal and in a book from the journal. Those are hard to get, but you can get the free ungated version that's up on Social Science Research Network. If you search Horwitz, Inequality, Poverty, you should find a paper titled something like Inequality, Poverty, and Mobility in America. That has a couple of these slides are from that and so on. So that's there. If you Google around that same sort of title, you'll find YouTube versions of this talk, I think, a couple longer ones. I'm trying to think what else. On the gender stuff, my book is Hayek's Modern Family, which for a while was on sale real cheap, but isn't anymore. And I also have to pitch my new book, which you mentioned, the Austrian Economics, an Introduction, which is available at libertarianism.org. You can buy it for $10 at Amazon, or download a copy free from the libertarianism.org site. There are 7 videos that go with it too. So if you're interested in learning about Austrian economics, there's your opportunity. If I think of any other good resources, maybe I'll just shoot them to Adam, and you guys can find a way.
We'll do that. Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. So that was today's talk. There will be others to come. July is a pretty packed month for us at European Students for Liberty Germany, and I'll just give everybody the opportunity to not miss any of our talks. So the day after tomorrow will be the talk "The Rise and Fall of the First Galactic Empire" by Mateusz Machaj, and on the 27th we will have "How the Liberal Idea Enriched the World" with Deirdre McCloskey.
Oh.
So
say hi to her for me, please.
We'll do that. We can send you the links, and you can join.
Yeah, that'd be great. Oh, that'd be great. She's awesome.
Yeah.
That's a good answer to the earlier question. How do you want to persuade people sort of on the left that we're humane and so on? Get them to read McCloskey.
All right. We'll do that. And then I'll thank you first for this amazing talk.
My pleasure, folks. Anytime.
And I also thank all of our participants. Without you guys, it won't be possible. So thank you very much. And